Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. My name is Giampiero Massolo. I'm the president of ISPI, the national coordinator of the Italian T20 in cooperation with our co-chair, the IAI. And I also want to introduce you to Ambassador Ferdinando Nelli Feroci, who is my colleague president of IAI. This is the final session of our T20 Inception conference, and of course, as you know, we will have an interesting debate among key participants, key actors in the multilateral framework of what we usually call the global governance. The G20 is searching for an impact role on world affairs, and the T20 is actually trying to enhance this possibility, offering ideas, materials of topics of reflection, actually trying to help the G20 finding an impact, finding a way to make the most of its deliberations and the most far-reaching possible impact on world affairs. The whole T20 exercise is there to help the G20 deliver on its objectives. The thematic forces just met for their first working sessions. 160 papers, policy brief, abstracts has been selected out of around 650 that were submitted. Now the co-author will start to work together, because the T20 is not only about thinking in a closed room, but thinking together. And in fact, we are really seriously engaged to bring some serious contributions to the final event of the Italian T20 that will take place between the end of September and early October, and then to bring on the table of our leaders a set of concrete proposals. I would like to leave the floor to Ambassador Nelli Feroci and to his opening remarks. Ferdinando, the floor is yours.
I'm Ferdinando Nelli Feroci, the president of IAI, the institute which has co-chaired and is co-chairing the T20 together with ISPI. Yesterday, we followed 3 very interesting roundtables, which were concentrated on the 3 main pillars of the agenda of the G20 under the Italian presidency: people, planet, prosperity. At the end of this morning, the task forces in which the T20 is articulating its proceeding have concluded their opening session. This plenary session will conclude. It's going to be the last session of the Inception conference of the G20. And this session is meant in particular to focus on the search of impact. In other words, we are supposed to answer the question of how the T20 can contribute to the success of the G20, can contribute with an analysis of the main items in the agenda of the T20, with some indications of priorities, but also with some policy recommendations, possibly implementable policy recommendations. This year is a very special year. We know, we always say that every year is special, but this is a very special year for many reasons. A pandemic of an unprecedented scope, an economic situation which is very worrying, almost a recession which is facing almost all the world, absolute poverty and inequalities in income distributions which are growing, climate change which remains a threat for present and future generations, energy transition, which remains to be completed and must be accelerated, the preservation of the environment, of the ecosystem, the digital divide, and the management of migratory flows. And despite some positive developments, more recent, I'm thinking in particular the elections in the US, of course, the world is still characterized by an unstable multipolar equilibrium and also by rules of the game that have been heavily contested in the recent past. The world is also in search of a new order. And the question which the G20 will have to face is to see how and to what extent it will be able to contribute to redefine this new world order, how it is capable to relaunch multilateralism. The T20, which we are opening today, which is a network of leading think tank and engagement group, is supposed to contribute with ideas to the proceedings and to the success of the G20. So this is why we have asked a number of prominent personalities to contribute to our proceedings. And I'm glad now to open the first session of this concluding plenary session, giving the floor to Mrs. Agnes Kalibata. She has been Minister of Agriculture in Rwanda. She's now Special Envoy of the Secretary General of the UN for the preparation of the UN System Food Summit, which is going to take place in October. It's going to be one of the main events of this year in the international scene. And my question to you, Dr. Kalibata, is what sort of indication do you expect that will emerge from the World Food Summit, and how the G20 can contribute to the proceeding of the summit, in particular, having in mind some of the main challenges when it comes to food security, food safe, food production, and food distribution. Thank you, Dr. Kalibata.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Ambassador, and thank you for having me over in this meeting. And I look forward to our partnership with the Italian government as we go into the Food System Summit, which we've already agreed will be hosted, the pre-summit will be hosted by the Italian government. So we look forward to that. Now, in terms of expectation of the Food System Summit, when the Secretary General launched the Food System Summit in his own words yesterday in a speech read to the CFS, he said his hope was that this becomes an opportunity for multilateralism to come together for the world, because we are behind on nearly all SDGs. We are behind on hunger. It has been increasing for the last 6 years. And with COVID-19, at 139 more million people are likely to go hungry. And nutrition is a major problem, with obesity that has become an underlying condition that really is fueling COVID-19 as a problem. And all the other issues around consumption. I've seen that in your previous deliberations, you've looked at how we reduce waste, and we know it's a major challenge. But also the whole perspective of how food systems themselves contribute to climate change. In fact, it is said that even if everybody else did their part, if we didn't do anything in food systems, we'd still be able to tip the 1.5 degrees. So we have a huge responsibility there from a food systems perspective to manage and control emissions coming from that end. But more importantly, and to the point you're making, my last 2 points on equity and better livelihoods for people, which has really been completely blown out of proportion. We've seen our understanding of the inequities among us coming from basically what COVID-19 has taught us, and we have to do better. We have it in us to be able to do better. And more importantly then, looking at climate change and the resilience that our systems need, our food systems need, but also the ability to help communities that are living in climate change adopt. So there's a whole lot that we can do with regards to taking action in all these areas and ensuring that we are transitioning the food system, because we need to ensure that the well-being of us as a people is better, but also the well-being of our planet is definitely at crossroads. And situations like COVID-19 are an example of what happens when you get to those crossroads. So, so many things can be done, and I've just highlighted the challenges that are here, and we have action tracks. We have those areas constitute 5 action tracks, and we have dialogues going on in countries. So from a G20 perspective, there's an opportunity to step forward and provide leadership and ensure that we come through as a world. We do have to come through. So being able to really find those areas where we can work together and come through, where we can build coalitions and partnerships that can help communities come through on hunger, on social protection, on all the inequities we are seeing today is going to be extremely important. And we are calling those, we will have to come up with game-changing ideas. And I hope that by the time of the G20, we'll already be having some very clear game-changing ideas that are profiled coming from the Food Systems Summit that people can actually implement.
Thank you.
Gabriela Ramos had an outstanding career in the Mexican public administration, public service, then a long and prestigious career in OECD. And she is now Assistant Director General for Social and Human Sciences of UNESCO. And Gabriela, I wanted to ask you, we are witnessing incredible progress in transformational new technologies, artificial intelligence, big data handling, and so on and so forth. And of course, it enhances productivity, but also polarizes the labor market and also enlarges, at the end of the day, income inequality. How should we behave? What should be the effort of the international community as embodied by the G20 to reduce the negative spillover generated by those technologies?
Thank you, Gianpiero, and thank you for inviting me. I'm always enjoying being with the T20, which is the intellectual arm of the G20, where you can be ambitious and you can be bold, and you can say things that maybe sometimes at the G20 table cannot be said as blunt, but when you say it, leaders listen to you, and I think that's why I'm so happy to be here. And you put it in the right framework, Gianpiero. It's true that the technologies are producing amazing deliverables. We just saw it with the COVID. They provided us with the opportunity to continue connected. They supported the development of a vaccine in a record time. They are delivering services in every single country in our way of working and living. But the truth is that the way they have been developed since, not now, but since its inception and going forward, they are opening up for wider gaps in terms of inequality. In terms of people that have access to the technology, we still have half of the world that is not connected. With people that have the possibility to participate in the development of these technologies, you know that artificial intelligence, it's really a high mark in terms of how do we advance these new products and services and solutions to our challenges. But we know that, for example, women are absent, and 80% of the development of these technologies are made by male-only teams. Nothing wrong with male, but I think that we need more diverse, more inclusive technologies to avoid what we are seeing is a very worrisome problem, which is all the biases, all the stereotypings, all the misinformation, all the malign use of these technologies that are real downsides that are blurring the very incredible contributions that they are making. In terms of productivity, in terms of labor market, again, we see a diverging path that we need to close. We see that the frontier firms that have the technologies or are developing the technologies from a very few number of countries are having productivity of 5% growth every year, 3%. This is something that Chiara Cursolo from the OECD who proved like 2 years ago, while the rest of the firms are flat. We see that in the labor market, again, those that are able and capable of taking advantage of the technology can really do magic. But we know also that in terms of the labor market, the developments are also skill biased, and those that have routine works or middle income works are really going are being hit hardly by the automation. Even though there is no massive unemployment as we thought there would be, what is happening is that the jobs created to link to the digital platforms are not as high quality as they should. And I would say that if there is one key issue that the G20 through the T20 can address, is how do we ensure that all the legal frameworks, all the legal protections, all the social security systems that we have produced in the analog world are translated into the digital world. We cannot leave the workers to be called entrepreneurs when they are your workers in the platform economy. And we cannot leave, as I said, women behind. Count on UNESCO. We are working on a recommendation on ethics of artificial intelligence to just turn around the conversation, instead of talking about technologies, talking about humans and people, as you said it in the Italian presidency. How do we put people at the center, diversity, inclusiveness, and to make the technology serve for our goals as humans and not the other way around? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, our next discussant is Alexander Stubb. He has a very long CV that I would only synthesize by saying that he has been Prime Minister of Finland, Foreign Minister of Finland, member of the European Parliament, and now is Director of the School for Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Florence. Alexander, we are all aware that the G20 has expanded its agenda. It's covering practically all possible major global policy issues. At the same time, the international context has evolved recently in a rather dramatic manner, partly as a consequence of COVID, but also for many other reasons. So where do you see a possible value added by the G20 in delivering adequate responses to the several challenges of the present situation?
Thank you very much for the questions, and greetings from Florence. I'm in my flat, which was built in 1450. That was a time when Finns were still living in grottos. So I feel very privileged to be here. And I guess you are pretty much posing a question to an outsider, because I think I read somewhere that Finland would be G29. And if the Nordics were in, we would be G9. But I consider myself to be a Finnish representative of the European Union. And I'll give you my insights on what I think G20 agenda is. My caveat is that I think G20 is one of the most important intergovernmental get-togethers, and to a certain extent institutions that we have today. Now, the way in which I see the role of the G20 is very simple. During the Cold War, the world was bipolar, the United States and the Soviet Union. Post-Cold War, so basically post-1989, the world was very unipolar. It was driven by the undisputed superpower of the world, in other words, the United States. Things started to change. Arguably, 2008 financial crisis, the post-American world as written by Fareed Zakaria, but certainly we can argue that the world today is multipolar. And in that multipolar world, there's a clear attack against multilateralism. And this is where I believe that G20 comes in, because it's an extremely interesting conglomeration of states, including, of course, the European Union. G20 has much more flexibility than a traditional multilateral institution could have. And in that sense, I think G20 has quite a lot more freedom to speak out its mind. Am I trying to say that the G20 is always going to say the same thing? No, it's not. So I think that what the G20 needs to do is basically to broaden the agenda of what would be called traditional geopolitics. I think geopolitics is much, much broader than what it used to be. And by that I mean that today, when we talk about conflicts escalating, many of them are hybrid. And therefore, I think the agenda of G20 should be hybrid. And I'll finish off with this. I think it should include, of course, trade and value chains, it should include climate, because that is a global good. It should include what Gabriela was talking about a second ago. In other words, things digital, because I do believe that anything that has to do with artificial intelligence, robotization, and the technological revolution, and especially data, is nowadays one of the most important commodities that the world has. And I think G20 is a good place to discuss it. Fourthly, as was mentioned by previous speakers, it should include health. And finally, I think the G20 should also have the audacity to look at hybrid threats, anywhere from information wars to various types of privacy issues. So my humble agenda for G20 is not revolutionary, but it includes trade, climate, digital, health, and hybrid. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gelsomina Vigliotti has a long career in the Italian public administration, namely in the finance ministry, and she is now serving as Director General for International Finance Relations in the Department of Treasury in the Italian Ministry of Finance. And Gelsomina, actually, of course, the question is easy. What is your opinion about the perspective for global economic recovery? But I would make it a little bit more complicated, saying and asking to you, what is the role of G20 from this point of view to bring more stability and resilience to world economy, and especially how can G20 materially help the more heavily indebted developing countries?
Thank you very much for inviting me to this session. Actually, all the previous speakers highlighted the very relevant issues for the economic recovery. Actually, we are all aware about the fact that the world is in one of the worst recessions since the Second World War. And even if we see signals of recovery, it's also widely recognized that the scars will be there for years. First of all, because, we have to ensure that, the vaccination, the pandemic is eradicated all over the world, not an easy task. And since there is no trade-off between recovery and health, our first priority is to ensure that we safeguard health, that we combat the pandemic, and that we eradicate it now and in the future. And actually, health within the finance track, it's one of the most relevant priorities that we want to address, since we strongly believe that, a sustainable recovery, a sustainable growth cannot be achieved if we are not prepared now and in the future to combat and avoid future pandemics. The prospect can be good, to recover for this great slowdown, but in order to ensure that we will be on a sustainable path of recovery, we have to ensure that we shift paradigms. We need new paradigms of growth, and actually all previous speakers enumerated a number of factors which will be key for this transformative recovery. And it to go through the digital transformation. Digitalization is something which is affecting all the sectors of the economy and the society, and we need to ensure that all can get the benefit of the digitalization. In the same regard, we have to be sure that also, the trade opportunities remain there, that the supply chains are not anymore blocked, that we can count on good and multilateral rules, which can ensure good transfer of goods and services. Also, we need to ensure that the recovery, it's a recovery which can provide jobs, opportunities, and upgrade of skills for everyone. Actually, sustainable growth can be sustainable only if it's also inclusive. And what we all know is that this crisis, it's actually affecting inequality at a large scale. And we have to ensure that this is avoided. And this is for the last part of the question about the vulnerable countries. What we have to avoid is that over the few months, the advanced countries can celebrate or can hope to celebrate the end of the pandemic through the vaccination campaign, even if we know that, there could be difficulties in the rollout of vaccination, as well as on the variants which can affect the effectiveness of the vaccination. But anyway, we are definitely making a much relevant progress, but it cannot be a good progress if this does not also can positively affect the vulnerable countries. Vulnerable countries which were already severely affected by the increasing of debt. And actually the crisis much more aggravated that situation. The international community is trying to address this issue. Several initiatives have been taken by the G20 for the suspension of debt payments, for creating a framework to solve unsustainable debt issues, so to free up resources to be dedicated to sustainable development goals. We have to show this year that these instruments are really effective, that they can work, and that actually they can free up resources for not retrenching back from the progress of the sustainable development goals. In this regard, the Italian presidency, and in particular within the finance track, we will pursue a double objective. On one side, to proceed on the debt agenda, to ensure that this agenda is transparent, to avoid that countries are blocked within indebtedness instruments, which can be very cumbersome, and so that they can rely on transparent and sustainable means of financing, but at the same time that it's new financing is available to these countries to proceed on the SDGs. And in this regard, the collaboration and the cooperation among all the international organizations will be relevant to achieve this objective. And actually, climate will be one of the most relevant topics that it will be relevant for all the topics that I mentioned until now. Climate can be is already one of the most relevant challenge which require global solution. And actually, we are now in a very good moment, geopolitical moment, to push ahead this agenda and ensure that by tackling the consequences of the climate changes, we can put the world on a more sustainable way. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this broad picture. It puts us in front of the complexities, of course, that the G20 is facing. Agnes Kalibata, G20 is actually the elephant in the room, because to the G20 it includes the biggest importers and exporters of food commodities worldwide. What the G20 should do to promote a sustainable transition of agri-food systems, preventing negative externalities on developing countries?
No, thank you. The elephant in the room part is funny, but thank you. So let me just paint a picture for you, what I see in developing countries that should constitute what I would call a perfect storm for growth, and yet we don't see it. Today, when you look at across all developing countries, the demographics are such that they have young people that mostly really are educated, by all standards. At least the literacy rates these days are high enough to say that most of these people are learned. Now, there's a whole lot of available technologies across the globe that we can access and are much easier to access than was the case in the past. They have opportunities for for growth of markets, and these markets are growing. But these things are not translating into the perfect storm you'd expect them to translate into of growth. Instead, for a continent, for example, like Africa, in 2008, when we were talking about the global food crisis, Africa was importing $15 billion worth of food. Today, Africa is importing $35 billion of food. And when we talk about dealing with hunger, we have 270 million of the people that are hungry in Africa. It only requires about $39 billion a year to deal with the issue of food security. So the equivalent exactly to the amount of money that we are using to import food for a continent that is perfectly in position to produce that food. So someone talked about the leadership that the G20 has the opportunity to offer as the most powerful intergovernmental forum that comes together. There are things that you could do to change the status of things. And these are issues you've discussed already in the past, that have already been discussed in the past, but things that we need to come through this time round. The issue of trade liberalization. And the whole standards thing has made it so difficult for Africa to participate in trade, or even other regions of the developing world to participate in trade. But again, there are things we can do to strengthen that perspective so that trade becomes more available to these countries. The issue of inclusivity of financing, being able, the cost of money and the cost of finance makes it so difficult for these countries to invest in what would otherwise constitute liberalized trade. But then there's also the issue of inclusivity and fair distribution of opportunity in global value chains, which we've been talking about forever, for a very long time now. So, I mean, if we didn't go into so many other things, just being able to make it possible for the developing world to participate in trade, or even the opportunity to feed itself, by not competing with cheap imports, by ensuring that the incentives are equal and fair on all sides of the world, which then takes me to another point from a food systems perspective. The conversation has been happening around transitioning from the current levels of subsidies that may be incentivizing the wrong behavior from a food systems perspective and from a footprint perspective. So there are a number of things we could do, but just focusing on the ability of these countries to engage fairly in financing and to engage fairly in trade might completely change where they are at, and might resolve some of the problems we are having from the SDG perspective. Like I said, the cost of hunger right now is exactly equivalent to the cost of the food that we buy as inputs.
Thank you.
Gabriela, back to you with a question on which you have partially already elaborated in your first intervention. Among the many challenges that the pandemic is posing to mankind, there is also the need to promote women's digital empowerment. Now, my question... sorry.
No, don't do that. Don't do that. Hello?
There must be something in the line. Hello, can you hear me? Gabriela, can you hear me? So my question is how the next G20 summit could strengthen or past initiative or undertake a new initiative to reduce the digital gender gap, and which additional policies are needed in this respect? Can you hear me, Gabriela?
I'm not hearing.
There seems to be a problem.
I'm not hearing.
I'm sorry. We try to solve the problem. Just a moment.
Hello?
Vado. Gabriella, can you hear me now? Maybe you could go with your question to Alexander Stubb, because there seems to be a problem with Gabriela Ramos.
Okay, so Alexander Stubb, we are running a risk here already. Agnes was speaking about it. That is, the poorer countries being left behind, and also trapped in a prolonged recession. Of course, it's a major endeavor for the international community, but the G20 is a body in which this kind of problem should be taken care of. Do you think that this is at all possible? And what can we do as G20 to mobilize as individual countries, but also through the international financial institutions? Is a coordination here a reasonable and reachable task or not?
I think it sure is. And I think what you need to do at the end of the day is to divide responsibility in the G20, because obviously the G20 covers pretty much all the continents in the world, and we are in this pandemic together. Let me qualify that. First observation I have about the pandemic itself, it's very much like the virus. It keeps on mutating in different types of directions. By that I mean to say that last year it was about trying to understand what this virus was about and how it spreads. Then it was about how to do lockdowns around the world and having best practices on how to deal with that. After that, was about rescue and recovery plans, which we saw ample of in, for instance, the European Union with 750 billion euros. After that, it was about negotiating vaccines. After that, it's about rollout of vaccines. And of course, I think the next phase, as you mentioned, of the mutation of the pandemic is going to be linked to an economic downturn. It's going to be linked to unemployment. It's going to be linked to bankruptcies. And I think the G20 would be very good in communicating this. I think the G20 should do probably the following things. Number one, exchange information and best practice. You saw what happened in the tit for tat of AstraZeneca, the European Commission, then the European Commission and the United Kingdom about the rollout of the AstraZeneca vaccine. We have to avoid this type of vaccine nationalism, and that's why it's very important that the G20 communicates and explains what's going on where. Secondly, I think the G20 should really work on communication about the pandemic, because there is linked, for instance, to information wars. There's a lot of disinformation about the vaccine's impact. There were hybrid attacks on the European Medical Agency. We've seen attacks on should you take the vaccine or not. I think it's very important that G20 all around the world talks about the good sides of the vaccine and is able to communicate it. I don't like the current communication on the vaccine, nor do I like the communication on the pandemic. I understand it, but I think it's silly. Basically, the current communication on the virus is about how many deaths, how many infections. The current communication about the pandemic is who has been successful in the vaccine rollout and who has failed. I think we're focusing on the wrong things when we do that, when it becomes some kind of a competition. And I think that's where G20 can help. Now, my third suggestion is that perhaps G20 could help in coordinating the vaccines. We are already now seeing a lot of good vaccines coming out from multinational corporations, from China, from Russia, help to make sure that it's equally distributed. By equal distribution, I mean to say that, it's irrelevant if a Finn gets vaccinated and a Swede doesn't. The hit is as hard, and we're all in this together. My final point is, why would you not try to nominate or coordinate international financial institutions regionally? I know that I work for the European Investment Bank, as will be known by some, for 2.5 years. And the European Investment Bank, together with other international financial institutions such as the World Bank, the EBRD, the AIIB, and many others, get together. Why doesn't the G20 coordinate the types of mitigating financial measures that the different international financial institutions can do? So I do think that, you know, if I was the Italian president at the moment, I would think of myself as one of the sort of spiders in the web, trying to distribute information around the world as best I can. Those would be my points.
Very good point. Thank you.
Gelsomina, back to you. During the crisis, we have seen that the global investment gap has deepened. And this is most likely a very serious problem that could actually hamper the prospect of economic recovery. So my question is very simple, is how the G20 could actually help stimulate more investment in infrastructure in particular, both at national but also at local level. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question, which is at the very heart of the program of the G20 finance track of the Italian presidency. Actually, infrastructure and investment is one of the topic which is much discussed by the finance ministers through the years. It's not only this year that finance ministers address this issue. They address this issue because actually investment is an important, is maybe one of the most relevant component of growth, is the link between the supply and the demand. And never as during a crisis like this, the impact of investment and in particular investment infrastructure can be relevant, since you know, infrastructure as a large multipliers, they can absorb a lot of jobs, so it can actually very much accelerate the path of the recovery. And in this regard, it will be key that the recovery plans by all the G20 economies very much rely on pushing investment infrastructure, and in particular green investment and green infrastructure. This is a good opportunity for, as I said before, a transformative approach to growth, and also, and in particular, you know, investment in infrastructure can make the difference. You know, infrastructure can be also a powerful instrument for inclusion. You know, for getting people in connection, and also to provide them opportunity to access markets, to access education, you know, to access welfare. And that's why that we want to promote a discussion and investment in infrastructure, you know, irrespective if we are talking about a digital infrastructure, that we learned how relevant are, especially during the crisis, for access to services and for keeping people included, and also you know, material infrastructure. And in particular, we want to focus on the relevance of maintenance. I mean, we do not have necessarily to build from scratch. Actually, there are, you know, a huge need of investment to maintain infrastructure all over the world, in advanced countries as well as in emerging and low-income countries. And maintenance is also a great opportunity to ensure that infrastructure becomes sustainable, which remain in line with the respect of the environment. And in this regard, we want to push this part of the agenda. You mentioned, Ambassador, the relevance of the local government. Actually, local governments play an important role in investment. I mean, many decisions are taken at local levels, and what is important is that you know, we can create the right incentives, the right link between the central governments and the local governments to ensure a consistent plan of investment, and in particular that local governments have the right resources to to provide infrastructure to their citizens, but also the technical capacity to plan and to implement a good infrastructure program. And in this regard, I'm glad to announce that actually also thanks to the support of the Istituto Affari Internazionali, that we are planning an event where we will call local authorities from the G20 countries to discuss in September which are the challenges and the opportunities for local governments to push the infrastructure agenda. Again, we look at the infrastructure investment not only as an instrument to sustain the recovery, which is very much needed, but also an instrument to promote inclusion, to promote connectivity, and to promote sustainability. I want to refer in conclusion to one of the issues which was raised by other speakers about the risk that the digitalization can insert in the process, but there are a lot of opportunities. And we have to make sure that everyone has the right skills and the right ability to catch up with the digitalization. In this regard, within the finance track program of the G20, we have plenty of initiatives which want to try to address these gaps, which range from the financial inclusion to the access to the skills, the access to the digital platform, which can support and help the small and medium enterprises to actually participate in the world economy. So infrastructure, it's it's a crucial pillar, and we believe that it's fundamental for a recovery which is really transformative. Thank you.
Thank you, Gelsomina. I'm told that maybe there is a possibility to reconnect with Gabriela Ramos. Yes, I see her. Well, Gabriela, thank you for being with us again. I'm sorry for the technical problem we had a few moments ago. Now I'm going to the question that I wanted to ask you before. Because among the lessons that we have learned from the pandemic, of course, there are many lessons, but one is that there is a need to promote women's digital empowerment. Now, my question is how the next G20 summit could either strengthen past initiatives or adopt new policies to solve these problems, to actually promote women's digital empowerment.
Thank you so much, and sorry for getting lost in the cyberspace. That happens sometimes. But thank you for the question. I feel that the G20 has been an incredible, powerful force for gender equality. And Italy has always been a champion of it. So we have a wonderful opportunity to really deliver for good. I know that the gender inequalities and the lack of the fact that you have 300 million less women connected to the internet, the fact that women are less enticed to go for the ITC disciplines or the STEM disciplines when they study for the maths, the fact that if you feel that women are underrepresented in the business sector in terms of only 5% in the Forbes 500 CEOs, in the digital sector, they are nowhere to be seen. But in the digital sector, as we are developing a world of its own, because it's really creating products, markets, and services that are either translating the analog into the digital or creating new ones, not having women represented is a real danger. As I said, 80% of the developments in the digital world are done by male-only teams, and this brings a problem of biases. It brings the problems of stereotyping, not because we do it on purpose, because it's just the mind frame that when you don't have diversity, you deliver lower outcomes than when you have inclusiveness. And therefore, the G20 has a real power here to set up very concrete policies. Countries in the G20 that still have gaps in the legislation and institutions for gender equality, just delete those. We cannot have that in the 21st century. Countries that have no dual parental leave, just adopt one. Because when the G20 adopted the target to reduce labor force participation gap, we saw how many countries in the G20 started to adopt dual parental leave to reduce the burden of the housework for women. And particularly in the digital world, go for affirmative action. I know that is not something that we love, but it's the only thing that works. Some quotas, some targets, some very concrete actions in the industry, but also in the teams that are advancing these technologies. We need to change the mindset, because even when we measure the performance of girls in school, you find that they have less confidence to do maths. And artificial intelligence is everything, and maths. I mean, maths at the core. So I think that this is very important. And what I would really recommend at the UNESCO, we are developing something else, because you can do with the legislation, you can dedicate resources, you can do for a gender gap recovery plan, which is what we call for. But the reality is that we also need to change the stereotypes, the mindset, and the biases against women. We need role models, and you have some role models in some leaders around the table, and I know that Mr. Draghi is one of those. I would go to create a network of male role models. This is something that we are doing in UNESCO, and we also have a very strong chapter on gender equality in the digital world in our ethics recommendations of artificial intelligence. So count on us, but be ambitious, be concrete, and have some institutions like the OECD, like UNESCO, to monitor and to make sure that the G20 delivers as you have done in the past. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabriela, for your indications. I mean, with this, we have concluded the first part of our session. And before giving the floor to Giampiero to open the next one, I would like to thank once more all the participants, Agnieszka Libata, Gabriela Ramos, Gelsomina Vigliotti, and Alexander Stubb, for their very useful, positive, concrete contributions. Thank you again, and see you soon. Giampiero, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you also on my behalf to the participants to the first panel. Very interesting contributions from you all. And let's now switch and go to the Sherpas. And our first Sherpa in this second panel is Abdulaziz Al-Rashid, who is the G20 sous-Sherpa and Assistant Minister for International Financial Affairs and Macro-Fiscal Policies of Saudi Arabia. And I would like you, of course, to ask you a pretty obvious question. That is how you see the legacy and the impact of the Saudi presidency of the G20, and where would you advise us to deepen and go forward with what you experienced last year? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and congratulations on a great start. I believe that if I would say the main legacy that I would never remember is our ability to adapt to the situation after the breakout of this pandemic. And I believe that adjusting our agenda with the help of other G20 members and international organizations, I believe that we have achieved a great adaptation during our presidency to focus on the immediate needs and requirements to combat the pandemic. So Saudi Arabia, as a strong believer and advocate of multilateralism and international cooperation, during its presidency, the leaders of the G20 came together twice to showcase the strength of the organization and the solidarity and cooperation. Also, the leaders agreed in a spirit of global solidarity to do whatever it takes to overcome the pandemic. And I believe that the outcomes that were in both summits were quite bold and effective. As usual, we all know that the G20 known to be more effective during crisis, and the revival of the G20 work during 2020 was a good example of that. So the immediate actions that were adopted during 2020 to save the lives and the livelihoods and the most vulnerable segments of the societies, I believe were very important. And just to highlight some of those legacies, I would say that the G20 countries were also swift in responding to the pandemic individually and collectively. And they collectively contributed and injected around $11 trillion into the global economy. Further, the G20 launched its historic debt service suspension initiative, providing the poorest and most vulnerable countries with urgent and immediate liquidity relief from official bilateral creditors. The initiative can provide $14 billion in 2020 alone from official bilateral creditors for eligible countries, which are around 73 countries. So another legacy, I would say, is the support to the access to COVID tools accelerator. And I believe that this was a great initiative that helped the efforts to fight the pandemic with regard to the to enhance the preparedness, whether it's protection, vaccines, or even remedies. And if I were to just mention some of the legacies that I believe we feel proud as Saudi Arabia and as a member of the G20, the circular carbon economy is one of the things that I believe adds to the tools and policies that can be adapted to fight climate change. We also agreed on global coral reef and research and development accelerator, also another initiative to reduce land degradation and habitat loss. One of the main outputs was the G20 action plan that sets out the key principles guiding our response and commitments with regard to COVID-19. I would also like to mention something that I believe is very important for the recovery of the global economy, which is the initiative on the future of the WTO. On the technology side and the infrastructure side, the G20 Riyadh Infratech agenda was also one of the outcomes of 2020. The roadmap towards a common framework for measuring digital economy, and also the G20 Youth roadmap and many more, especially with regard to inclusiveness. So with this, I believe that G20 during 2020 have a strong case to show about how they can come together and really make an impact on both health and the economy. And thank you very much.
Thank you. A very engaging legacy, actually, and congratulations to you.
Hello. Next speaker is Rizal Afandi Lukman, Deputy Coordinating Minister for Economic Affairs, but also Indonesia's G20 Sherpa. Welcome, Rizal. My question may appear a bit premature because, as we heard from the previous speaker, one of the quality of G20 is to adapt to the situations, and we are seeing this in 2020. But we have a curiosity, of course, and is how are you preparing your G20? Do you already have an idea of your agenda, of the priorities that counts for Indonesia and more generally for Southern Asia?
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to firstly to congratulate to the 2020 of Italian presidency for having this event, which is, I think, it's a good start. Indonesia is becoming presidency for next year. On the G20 members particularly to change the vulnerabilities to resiliency. And this should be a shared understanding within the G20. We should do so by committing ourselves to collaborate for a stronger and better recovery process. And we believe next year will be still in the recovery of our global economy. And we're going to do this. First, reviving international cooperation in the forum by focusing on the area that help boosting economic recovery, such as improving productivity, increasing resiliency and stability, and promoting sustainability and inclusive growth. Therefore, G20 should be more dedicated than ever in discussing topics that are close to the people, as well as the recovery process such as education, human capital investment, health, SDGs, tourism, and as well as youth and women. Second, Indonesia see the need to strengthen the instruments the G20 has in making for relevant to primarily better global crisis preparedness and response. In this regard, we are open and kindly seek the views from the in best mechanism to take this initiative forward. And third, the T20 can be seen as the voice of reasons for the betterment of the global economy and development. Since Mexico presidency in 2012, the T20 as a platform to exchange ideas with careful examination that lead to the birth of recommendations to our leaders. In time of crisis, the role of T20 inflates in shaping the directions of economic policy response with a quick, innovative, and accurate character while maintaining low risk and less costly to the economy. Next year, the T20 should also arrive with a new thinking on us to push recovery further, better, and stronger. Time contemplate on the exit from a heavily stimulus-led economy, as well as to the momentum for transformation and resetting the most affected sector from the pandemic, such as tourism, the most dynamic challenge, which is future of works.
I would turn now to Nicolas Pinault, who is the OECD Sherpa for G7 and G20. And I would ask you a question that is fairly difficult to get an answer. I was also Sherpa G7 and G20, and I know how difficult it is. It's about building consensus. In your experience, how you do to build consensus without really just simply settling on the always on the lowest common denominator? Is it possible in an unwieldy format like a G20?
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for the invitation to this important T20 meeting. Last year I think we've shown, and actually I'm very much in line with what the Saudi colleagues said. We showed that it was possible to reach consensus at a multilateral level despite all the difficulties. Last year we were facing a very polarized geopolitical environment that was made even more difficult by the crisis. All the meetings took place in a virtual format, which did not help with the negotiations. And still, as my Saudi colleague recalled, we achieved important outcomes. This synchronized stimulus package of $11 trillion US, flagship initiatives such as the DSSI, which is important because it's an important milestone in bringing together Paris Club and non-Paris Club members. That was also the expansion of IMF resources. So these are important results in a very difficult environment. So it's possible to build consensus even on difficult issues in a difficult environment. But it's true when we look at other issues like, for instance, trade, international taxation, health. The outcome is a bit more mixed. So how do we build a consensus on such difficult issues? I think there the experience really shows that we need a very agile and flexible form of multilateralism, of arrangements to advance the multilateral discussion in a pragmatic manner, step by step, where there is a sufficient consensus to precisely solve the issues that are contentions. And let me give you a couple of examples. I think in the area of health, this is exactly what has been done with the ACTA and the COVAX facility. These are initiatives which don't have all G20 members on board, but which have given a strong political momentum to the issue of global health and pandemic preparedness. Generally speaking, I think this is precisely the role of the G20 to provide this kind of flexible, informal framework for multilateral discussions, and to be able to set up ad hoc bodies where those issues are discussed, where countries, a coalition of the willing, can advance consensus. And let me give you another example, which I think has been extremely successful in the G20. This is the work on tax. This is exactly the kind of solutions on tax, on tax evasion, on tax avoidance that we have achieved through this kind of informal settings. If you take tax evasion, we set up the Global Forum on Tax Transparency in 2009, 2010. Then to address base erosion and profit shifting related issues, we set up with the support, and that was the OECD, which was behind this initiative, but with the strong political impetus from the G20, we set up the inclusive framework on BEPS, and we have made tremendous progress in terms of reducing aggressive tax planning and optimization. So I think that we need this kind of multilateral settings, very agile, very flexible, ad hoc, with light bureaucracy, but with a strong sense of purpose. And in that context, in those settings, we can advance very pragmatic solutions to difficult issues.
Thank you.
Mr. Abdulaziz Al-Rashid, once more to you. You have already given a very exhaustive explanation of what actually the G20 under the Saudi presidency delivered. My question now is more precise, and I would ask you, which are the policy areas where you see more possibility of continuity between your G20, if I may say so, and the Italian G20?
Thank you very much. In Saudi Arabia during 2020, I think that we have worked very closely with Troika members, including Italy. And I think that the Italian agenda reflects that close coordination. And I would like to commend the focus of the G20 agenda this year on people, planet, and prosperity, as it is exactly the right approach that the G20 should continue to take as we move forward, as it builds on the approach taken during our presidency. If I would like to focus on some areas that I think continuity is essential, and I can see that happening right now. Something that OECD have mentioned a while ago, international taxation. I think that maybe during the pandemic there was other issues that may have took priority, but I believe that the political stage this year might give that more momentum during 2021, especially the taxation on digital economy. Another area that I think I would like to see continuing is the approach that we took in Saudi Arabia with regard to climate change issues and environmental issues. And we have introduced the Circular Carbon Economy Initiative, which provide a comprehensive approach to reduce all emissions and is also a subset of the circular economy framework. I would also would like to mention the accelerating access to pandemic tools and boosting international support to the ACT Accelerator in order to provide prevention and protection tools during the pandemic, in addition to discussing long-term pandemic preparedness gaps. The Riyadh Initiative on the future of the WTO to provide a concrete steps for members to work constructively toward the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference and the necessary reform of the World Trade Organizations. Another aspect, which is the technology, and we tried during our presidency to have technology as a cross-cutting issue, and one main element of that is our infratech agenda. And I believe that Italy is continuing the work on the infrastructure and the digital infrastructure in that regard. Last but not least, I would say the G20 was also determined on highlighting the important role of smart cities, measurement of digital economy, digital security, and connecting humanity in the context of the current crisis, with a long-term vision to build economic resiliency. So these areas should not only be discussed within the members by government, but also by civil society through the engagement groups. And I believe that the T20 is one of the main places for such discussions and one of the major contributors to the G20. Last year, the T20 united authors of 150 policy briefs submitted to the T20 Saudi Arabia via its 11 task forces, authors representing over 150 institutions joining from more than 60 countries. So the role now is to continue that work in preserving this legacy during the Italian presidency and the presidencies to come. Thought leaders, knowledge partners, scientists, professors, global thinkers, everyone who can contribute through the engagement group should continue their contribution to inform the governmental side of the G20. And thank you all for your contributions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I will turn now to Rizal Afandi Lukman. Actually, you're being the chair after Italy, and the G20 is, of course, an anthem to multilateralization. It's an anthem on consultation and solving together problems. But the underlying word risks to be a little bit more unwieldy than what we've been describing until now. Against this backdrop, and bearing in mind that after all, the G20 is about the West, China, the emerging powers, and the so-called Asian democracies, what the Indonesian presidency would have in mind in order to manage this kind of underlying situation, which is a little bit different from what we usually speak about?
Yes, thank you. Firstly, Indonesia in South America, where this region composed of 10 member countries united under the ASEAN economy experienced contraction quite significantly due to the intensifying spread of COVID-19. Therefore, ASEAN had resorted to regional mechanism by virtue of introducing the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework and its implementation plan. It is the overall desire of the ASEAN members for collaborative measures that emphasize on the holistic, inclusive, and science-based approach to reopen the economy. In this regard, ensuring the regional mechanisms such as the recently RCEP has been signed will be promptly implemented is becoming high agenda of the individual ASEAN members. Second, Indonesia continues to prioritize approach between health and economic consideration in addressing the economic. Our safeguarding the life and the livelihood of the people as still remain as our top priority. In the health sector, we will expedite the vaccination program to achieve the more our people being vaccinated this year, at least reach 70% in order to achieve the herd immunity. In the economic sector, recovery budget will continue to occupy the largest part of our state expenditures. The government of Indonesia has already allocated about 40 billion US dollars this year, where health priority programs that is the most sector, which is on the tourism, will be significant increase tier allocation. Furthermore, the household consumption, investment, government spending, and export will likely be high in the National Economic Program as we encourage to achieve positive and reach about 5% GDP growth for this year. So in addition, we will also continue as part of the instrument, in addition to fiscal and monetary policy, which is on the domestic reform program that include the implementation of the Omnibus Law on job creation in the next few months. And concerning the role of G20, I believe as a forum that was born out of a crisis, the G20 should have been able to amplify its role more significantly in addressing a crisis. And as the global community faces crisis ever since, it is not an exaggeration to say it was in its complacency by allowing for issues proliferation dominating of the forum. For instance, the G20 working groups and task force grew enormously from just 7 in 2011 to 14 in 2019. Similarly, the commitments have increased from just 36 in 2008 during the Washington meeting to 9 during the Hamburg summit in 2017. This ultimately demonstrate the agenda has become more widely and continued practice of this could be eventually justify the perception that advocate the ineffectiveness of the G20 in addressing, let alone predicting a global crisis. Therefore, Indonesia appreciates the Saudi presidency in delivering a concrete and workable outcome to address the COVID-19 crisis, most notably the initiative of debt service suspension for the poor and low-income countries. The Italian presidency saw an opportunity to solidify policy coordination and cooperation among G20 countries in time of crisis. This is an important element in rebuilding the global trust toward multilateralism, and Indonesia would like to be part of the solution. Thus, being member of the Indonesia stand ready to achieve this shared aspiration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So back to Nicola. You know, over the years, the OECD has provided an enormous amount of, let's call it like that, technical support to the proceedings of the G20. You have mentioned in your previous intervention the work done in particular on taxation, And by the way, the problems of taxation within the G20 agenda has been mentioned also by the Saudi Sherpa. And it's a very delicate question, highly controversial. And I hope that the OECD may soon find an agreeable common denominator, in particular on this point. My question is a bit different, is on what other policy areas you think that the OECD could provide an input in order for the G20 to deliver with policy recommendations that are actually implementable?
Okay, thank you. Well, taxation is obviously one key area, and we are working on it. But honestly, I don't think the real problem is a technical one. The one is one of political agreement on a solution. I think the various parameters of the solution on both pillars of the tax digitalization package are relatively well known. What we need now is a political consensus on some of those parameters. Let me say a word of how the OECD is indeed working with the G20 to ensure that the G20 can find a compromise and consensus on some of the issues, which relates very much with what you said before, and give you a couple of examples. The first thing that as OECD we are doing is really to provide the evidence base to the G20. And this may sound a bit old school. In a sort of a post-truth environment, we may have some depth about the strength of the evidence base, of the facts, of the data. But still, I mean, I believe, we believe at the OECD that it's a precondition for any kind of policy discussion. And we've shown precisely in the agenda of tax, but I could mention several other examples. For instance, in the trade area, with all the work that we've done on trade in value added, on global value chains, we've shown how imbricated are global supply chains and how self-defeating our mercantilist approach to trade. So we have informed the G20 discussion, and this is really, as I said, a precondition to forge a policy consensus. Without that, the policymakers, they are essentially flying in the dark. So that's the first pillar. The second one, indeed, you need to have mechanisms in place. You need to have standards. You need to have platforms to discuss, to forge this consensus. And the OECD was also there to provide this kind of platforms. I mentioned the ones on tax, but there are other policy areas like food security. For instance, in 2011, under the French presidency, we helped the G20 set up this AMIS platform on food security, which was an important step forward. When it comes to standards, obviously there are the tax standards on tax transparency. There is also in the field of anti-corruption the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, which is the golden standard. So we are really there to provide the mechanisms. And finally, I also believe that we need for the G20 really to talk the talk, but also to walk the talk. And there is perhaps sometimes a lack of accountability in the G20, and we are also there to help the G20 precisely be more accountable, monitor its progress on the commitments it has made, and there are a couple of examples. For instance, the 25 by 25 targets on gender participation in the labor market. That's something that was agreed in 2014 under the Australian presidency. This is so the objective of reducing the gender gap labor market participation by 25% by 2025. And so this target is still ongoing, and the OECD is there to precisely monitor progress towards the achievements of this target. And there are other examples. If we look forward, in 2019, the G20 endorsed the AI principles, the principle on artificial intelligence, promoting a human-centric vision of artificial intelligence. Now we need to implement those principles, and the OECD is there also to help G20 members to really track the implementation of those principles through their AI policies. So these are the kind of things that that the OECD can do to really help the G20 make decisions and make sure that those decisions are implemented, that the G20 is accountable, and this is absolutely essential in terms of legitimacy vis-à-vis the public.
Thank you, Nicolas. With this, we have come to the conclusion of our Inception conference, the conference which has launched the T20 proceedings. It's only the beginning of the story. The task forces will work from today on. Stay with us, stay in touch, follow our proceedings. I am sure that they're going to be interesting, that will help you, all participants, to follow also the proceedings of the bigger G20. Thank you again, and thank you to all participants to this conference.
Thank you also on my behalf, on behalf of ISPI. Stay tuned, and we'll hear about us. Thank you. Bye-bye.